Paolo was only 14 years old, but his life already carried a weight that many adults couldn't bear. From a young age, he had a very strong bond with his maternal grandfather Pedro. His grandfather was more than a family figure to Paolo. He was a mentor, a friend, and above all, a substitute for the mother he had lost so early. Paolo's mother had passed away when he was just 6 years old. Since then, he and his father, Francisco, had a distant and fragmented relationship. Francisco, a man of few words and many silences, seemed to struggle with how to deal with his son after his wife's death. Working long hours as a truck driver, Francisco was absent most of the time, leaving Paolo under the attentive care of his grandfather Pedro. Pedro was a respected mechanic in the small town where they lived. His workshop, located behind the house, was a true sanctuary for Paolo. The smell of oil, the sound of tools, and the shine of metal parts had enchanted the boy since he could remember. There he spent hours watching his grandfather work, learning the secrets of engines and dreaming of the day he would become a mechanic as skilled as Pedro. One afternoon after school, Paolo ran to his grandfather's workshop, where he knew Pedro would be working on some project. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and the workshop was bathed in the soft light of dusk. "Hi, Grandpa," Paolo called, entering the workshop with a smile on his face. Pedro looked up from under the hood of an old car and smiled back. Hello, my boy," Pedro replied, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. How was school today?" "It was good. We had a math test, and I think I did well," Paolo said, approaching his grandfather. "And you've been working on this car since yesterday, right?" Yes, it's an old car, needs a lot of care, but nothing we can't handle together, right?" Pedro winked at Paolo, who felt proud to be included in the work. Paolo grabbed a screwdriver and began helping his grandfather, feeling at home in that familiar and safe environment. As they worked, they talked about life, cars, and dreams. "Yeah, I want to be a mechanic as good as you," Paolo said, his eyes shining with determination. Pedro paused for a moment, looking at his grandson with a mix of pride and tenderness. "I have no doubt about that, Paolo. You have talent and passion for what you do, and that's the most important thing. Besides, you have your heart in the right place," Pedro said, placing his hand on Paolo's shoulder. "Your mother would be very proud of you." The mention of Paolo's mother brought a momentary silence between them. It was a delicate topic, but Pedro always knew how to handle the pain in a comforting way. "I miss her, Grandpa," Paolo murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I know, my dear, I miss her too," Pedro replied, pulling Paolo into a tight hug. "But know that she is always with you, in every choice you make, in every achievement of yours." After a long hug, they went back to work, and the workshop was filled again with the familiar sounds of tools and laughter. Pedro's presence was a cornerstone in Paolo's life, a constant amidst the uncertainties of his adolescence. Francisco, on the other hand, was a distant and almost unknown figure to Paolo. The few conversations they had were superficial and brief. Francisco seemed to carry an invisible weight, a pain he never shared with his son. One night, as he was preparing to sleep, Paolo thought about how nice it would be if he could get closer to his father, share his passions and dreams with him, just as he did with his grandfather. But those moments were rare, and Paolo contented himself with Pedro's affection and support. Days went on, and Paolo continued to learn and grow under his grandfather's guidance. Every part he dismantled and reassembled, every engine he repaired, was another step towards his dream. And despite the difficulties and the absence of his father, Paolo knew he had in Pedro the unconditional support he needed to keep moving forward. And so Paolo's life went on, marked by his love for cars and his deep bond with his grandfather, who was the rock he leaned on in the toughest times. It was a sunny afternoon when Paolo returned from school, eager to share the day's news with his grandfather. He entered the house with a smile, but something was different. The workshop was silent, the usual sound of tools was missing. Paolo felt a chill run down his spine. Grandpa," she called, walking towards the workshop. Upon entering, Paolo found his grandfather lying on the floor next to a partially disassembled car. Paolo's heart raced, and he ran to Pedro, kneeling beside him. Grandpa, are you okay? He asked, his voice trembling with concern. Pedro slowly opened his eyes, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. Paulo, my boy, he murmured with difficulty. Yeah, I'm going to call for help. Stay here, Paulo said, getting up quickly. He ran to the front door and started shouting for help. The neighbors, hearing Paulo's desperate cries, rushed to the house. Mrs. Maria, the closest neighbor, was the first to arrive. What happened, Paulo? She asked, already calling for emergency services when she saw Pedro on the floor. My grandfather, he's in bad shape, Paulo replied, his voice heavy with panic. A few minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics quickly stabilized Pedro and placed him on the stretcher. Paulo held his grandfather's hand, trying to hold back his tears. Grandpa, you're going to be okay. I'm here with you, he said as the paramedics carried Pedro to the ambulance. Pedro squeezed his grandson's hand, his eyes shining with a mix of pain and love. I love you, Paulo. I've always been proud of you. Never forget that, Pedro said, his voice weak but full of emotion. I love you too, Grandpa. Please don't leave me, Paulo replied, tears finally streaming down his face. Inside the ambulance, as the paramedics tried to stabilize Pedro, he kept looking at Paulo as if saying goodbye. Paulo felt a tightness in his heart, a terrible premonition. Upon arriving at the hospital, Pedro was immediately taken to the emergency room. Paulo was left in the waiting area, his hands still trembling, his face wet with tears. Time seemed to drag painfully as he waited for news. After what felt like hours, a doctor approached with a serious expression. Paulo? He called, looking at the boy with sympathy. Your grandfather suffered a heart attack. We did everything we could, but he didn't make it. I'm so sorry. Paulo's world crumbled at that moment. He fell to his knees, tears flowing freely. The pain of the loss was overwhelming, and he felt as if a piece of his soul had been torn away. Sitting alone on a hospital bench, Paulo couldn't stop thinking about what his life would be like without his grandfather. Pedro had been his guide, his mentor, the person he loved most in the world. The uncertainty and sadness were crushing. As he was lost in his thoughts, Francisco arrived at the hospital. He seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to comfort his son. Paulo? He called, his voice hesitant. Paulo looked up, his eyes red from crying. Francisco sat down beside him, unsure of what to say or do. I'm sorry about your grandfather, Francisco said, awkwardly placing a hand on Paulo's shoulder. I know he was very important to you. Paulo nodded, unable to speak. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Francisco wanted to comfort his son, but the emotional distance between them made it difficult. I'm here for you, Paulo. Even though I haven't been very present, I'm here now, Francisco said, his voice trembling. Paulo looked at his father, seeing for the first time a glimpse of vulnerability on his face. Perhaps, he thought, this was the beginning of something new between them. Even amid the pain and loss, there was a small hope that they might grow closer. They sat together in silence, sharing the weight of the loss and the hope for a new beginning. Pedro's funeral was cloudy and sad. The gray sky seemed to reflect the pain Paulo felt in his heart. He stood beside his grandfather's casket, tears silently streaming down his face. Francisco was by his side, visibly uncomfortable, trying to find a way to comfort his son. It's going to be okay, Paulo, Francisco said, awkwardly placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Your grandfather is in a better place now. Paulo nodded but didn't say anything. His father's words of comfort couldn't fill the void that Pedro had left in his life. He felt lost, as if the compass that had always guided him had disappeared. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. The tools in the workshop were silent, and Pedro's absence was palpable in every corner. Francisco decided it would be better for Paulo to move to his house, where he could receive the care and support of a family. Francisco had been married for a year to Elizabeth, a kind and attentive woman. Elizabeth had a son from a previous marriage, Ronaldo. When Paolo arrived at the new house, he was warmly greeted by Elizabeth and Ronaldo. Paolo, this is Elizabeth, my wife, and this is Ronaldo, Francisco said, introducing them. It's a pleasure to meet you, Paolo, Elizabeth said, smiling. Make yourself at home, this house is now yours too. Hi Paolo, Ronaldo greeted with a friendly smile.
Heard you like cars.
I'm a car fan too. We can talk about that later if you want. Paolo nodded shyly, still shaken by the loss of his grandfather. However, the warm reception made him feel a bit more at ease. He was shown to his new room, which was cozy and well decorated. In the following days, Paolo began to adapt to the new routine. Elizabeth treated him as if he were her own child, always asking if he was okay, if he was hungry, or if he needed help with homework. Paolo, have you done your homework yet? She would ask gently while preparing dinner. Yes, I've done it. Thank you, Paolo replied, feeling comforted by her care. Ronaldo also became a great friend to Paolo. They shared common interests, especially a love for cars. They often spent afternoons talking about engines, models, and dreams of becoming mechanics. Did you know my grandfather had a workshop? Paolo said to Ronaldo during one of their conversations. I used to spend a lot of time there, learning from him. That's amazing. Ronaldo replied, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. Maybe we can try building a model together someday. Sure, I'd love that, Paolo said, smiling for the first time in days. Despite still deeply missing his grandfather, Paolo began to find a new balance in his life. The way Francisco, Elizabeth, and Ronaldo treated him made him feel more comfortable and less alone. Francisco, even with his difficulty in expressing emotions, was making an effort to connect with his son. One night, Francisco entered Paolo's room while he was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Paolo, I just want you to know that I'm here for you. I know I've never been good at showing it, but I'm trying to improve, Francisco said. Paolo looked at his father, feeling grateful. I know, Dad. Thank you for being here, Paolo responded, feeling a bit closer to his father. The pain of Pedro's loss was still present, but the love and care from his new family were helping Paolo move forward. He knew he would never forget his grandfather, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Over time, he began to believe that even without Pedro by his side, he could achieve his dreams and find happiness again. Francisco watched his son attentively. Although Paolo was adapting well to the new house and family, Francisco could still see the sadness in the boy's eyes. Determined to do something special to lift his son's spirits, Francisco had an idea. The next day, Francisco went to Pedro's old workshop. There, he found one of the old cars Pedro had been working on. The car was unfinished, but Francisco knew that project meant a lot to Paolo. With the help of friends, he transported the incomplete car to his home. When Paolo arrived home from school that afternoon, he found the old car parked in the yard. His eyes widened in surprise and happiness when he saw his grandfather's project in front of him. Dad, this is Grandpa's car. Paolo exclaimed, running up to the vehicle. How did you manage to bring it here? Francisco smiled at his son's reaction. I thought it would be a nice surprise for you. We can finish assembling it together. What do you think? Francisco said, placing a hand on Paolo's shoulder. For the first time since his grandfather's death, Paolo felt a genuine joy. He hugged his father, thanking him for the surprise. This means a lot to me, Dad. Thank you, Paolo said, with his eyes shining. Ronaldo, who had been watching the scene from a distance, felt a pang of envy. Although Francisco wasn't his biological father, he wished he received the same attention and affection. Elizabeth, seeing the old car in the yard, made a strange expression but knew that it was important to Paolo. It's a nice gesture, Francisco. If it makes Paolo happy, that's what matters, Elizabeth said, though her expression showed some concern about the car being in the yard. I'll need to travel for a few weeks, Francisco told Paolo later that night. But I promise I'll be back soon. I want you to start planning what we'll do with the car, okay? Paolo felt a pang in his chest at the news of his father's trip. He was starting to get used to Francisco's presence and didn't want him to be away for so long. I'm going to miss you, Dad, Paolo said, with a lump in his throat. I'm going to miss you too, son, but you're in good hands. Elizabeth will take good care of you, Francisco replied, trying to comfort him. Elizabeth appeared at the door with a warm smile. Don't worry, Francisco, I'll take care of Paolo. He'll be safe and well here, she said, looking at Paolo with tenderness. Francisco then said his goodbyes, got into his truck, and drove away, leaving Paolo and Elizabeth alone in the house. Let's go inside, Paolo. You've had a long day, Elizabeth said, guiding him back inside. Paolo went to his room, feeling the loneliness weigh on him again, but the sight of the car in the yard gave him a sense of hope and connection to his grandfather. He knew that with Elizabeth's support and his father's promise to work on the car together, things might get better. Paolo lay down in bed, staring at the ceiling, and gradually his worries began to dissipate. He fell asleep with the image of his grandfather and the car in his mind, feeling that somehow, Pedro was still with him. The next day, Paolo was woken up early by Elizabeth. She entered his room with a serious expression and a list of tasks in her hands. Paolo, I need you to help me clean the house today, she said, leaving little room for discussion. Paolo, still groggy, got up and started working. As he scrubbed the floors and cleaned the furniture, he watched Ronaldo playing video games in the living room. He wondered why his stepbrother wasn't helping, but decided not to say anything, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. Elizabeth helped a bit with the cleaning, but soon went to the phone and started chatting with a friend. Paolo was left almost alone with the housework. He cleaned every room, feeling fatigue set in, but complied with his stepmother's demands without complaining. The following days followed the same pattern. Elizabeth began asking Paolo to do more and more chores. Even after school, he washed clothes, did groceries, and helped with the kitchen. Ronaldo, on the other hand, continued with his activities without being bothered. Paolo felt exhausted but didn't want to cause any trouble. Ronaldo noticed that Paolo was always busy and began to distance himself. There was no more time for them to talk about cars or play together. Paolo missed these interactions but couldn't find a way to balance the chores and leisure. One afternoon, while washing dishes, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth went to answer and shortly after, returned with a man by her side. Paolo, this is Andre, my brother, Elizabeth said, introducing the man. Nice to meet you, Paolo, Andre said, extending his hand. Paolo shook his hand, feeling a bit uncomfortable with his presence. As Paolo continued washing the dishes, Andre and Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table, chatting animatedly. Paolo noticed that, in the following days, Elizabeth became even stricter with him. Her words were increasingly harsh and blunt, while she treated Ronaldo with affection and attention. Paolo was thrilled to see his father, who brought presents for everyone. Francisco, noticing Paolo's joy, smiled and hugged him. I have a surprise for you, Paolo, Francisco said, handing him a box. Inside was a set of brand new tools. For you to use on your grandfather's car. Thank you, Dad, Paolo said, moved by the gift. With Francisco's return, Elizabeth's behavior changed dramatically. She began treating Paolo well again, offering him attention and care, as she had before Francisco left. Paolo noticed the difference but said nothing, simply enjoying the time with his father and the new harmony at home. Life seemed to return to normal, and Paolo felt more relieved and happy. Although the previous weeks had been tough, he could now enjoy his father's presence and continue his dream of working on his grandfather's car. Francisco and Paolo began assembling the car piece by piece. It was a challenging but rewarding project that brought them even closer. They spent entire afternoons in the garage, swapping parts, tightening screws, and discussing the best way to restore the vehicle. Everything seemed to be returning to normal, and life followed a peaceful and productive rhythm. One day, while they were immersed in their work, Andre showed up for a visit. He greeted Francisco with a friendly smile. Hi, Francisco. How's everything going? Andre asked, shaking his hand. We're doing well, working on Pedro's car, Francisco replied, pointing to the vehicle. That looks like a great project. Maybe I can help out sometime, Andre said, observing the car with interest. That would be great. It's always good to have extra hands, Francisco replied, gratefully accepting the offer. After a brief conversation, Andre went to talk with his sister, Elizabeth, before saying goodbye and leaving. Francisco then noticed that Paulo seemed more tired and thinner than usual. Concerned, he called his son for a talk. Paulo, are you okay? Is there something you want to tell me? Francisco asked, closely observing his son's face. Paulo hesitated for a moment but decided not to worry his father. Yeah, I'm fine, Dad. I'm just studying a lot for the exams, he said, forcing a smile. Francisco nodded, but his concern didn't leave his eyes. A few days later, Francisco had to travel again. The news left Paulo apprehensive, fearing what might happen in his father's absence. Yeah, I'm going to miss you, Dad, Paulo said, hugging Francisco tightly. I'll miss you too, son, but I'll be back soon. Take care, and call me if you need anything, Francisco said, trying to reassure his son. As soon as Francisco left for his trip, Elizabeth's behavior changed drastically. She began treating Paulo with coldness and authoritarianism again, turning him into a servant. The chores piled up, and Paulo barely had time to study or rest. Ronaldo, on the other hand, continued to receive preferential treatment, which only heightened Paulo's sense of injustice. A week later, Francisco returned home. He immediately noticed that Paulo was even thinner and more tired, and his grades had worsened. Concerned, he called his son for a serious talk. Paulo, are you okay? What's really going on? Francisco asked, his voice filled with concern. Paulo finally decided to tell the truth. Dad, while you were gone, Elizabeth treated me like a servant. I had to do all the house chores alone. I'm exhausted and can't study properly, Paulo confessed, feeling tears well up in his eyes. Francisco frowned, incredulous. Paulo, this is serious. But Elizabeth is trying to teach you responsibility. You need to learn to handle your responsibilities, Francisco said, not realizing the severity of the situation. No, Dad, she treats me badly. It's different from learning responsibility, Paulo insisted, but the disappointment was evident. Francisco sighed, finding it hard to believe his son's words. I know it's hard, but trust me. Elizabeth just wants what's best for you, he said, ending the conversation. That night, Paulo went to bed with a heavy and sad heart. He felt misunderstood and alone, unable to make his father understand what was really happening. Tears fell silently as he stared at the ceiling, wishing things were different. Thus, the darkness of the night embraced Paulo, who fell asleep with a mind full of worries and a heart full of sadness. Francisco had to travel again, leaving Paulo with a feeling of apprehension. As soon as Francisco left, Elizabeth became even harsher. Paulo, clean the entire house today, and I want it spotless, as she ordered, with no room for argument. Paulo obeyed in silence, starting to clean. Bet and Ronaldo were getting ready to go out. We're heading to the pizza place. Have fun cleaning, Ronaldo mocked, laughing as he got into the car. Paulo watched the car drive away, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. He began cleaning the living room, scrubbing the floor and dusting the furniture, but his mind was elsewhere. He felt wronged but knew that complaining would only make things worse. Ronaldo was treated like a prince, while Paulo was treated like a servant. As he cleaned, Paulo remembered the conversations he had with his grandfather Pedro. His grandfather always encouraged him to be strong and never give up, even in the toughest situations. These thoughts helped him keep going despite the hardships. After cleaning the living room, Paulo went to the kitchen and started washing the dishes. The work seemed endless, but he kept at it. Finally, after hours of cleaning, he finished all the chores and went to bed exhausted. It was past midnight when Elizabeth and Ronaldo came home, accompanied by Andre. Paolo heard the sound of the car arriving and decided to lock himself in his room to avoid confrontations. However, the noise of laughter and conversations coming from the living room made him curious. In the middle of the night, Paolo woke up thirsty and decided to go to the kitchen for a drink. As he descended the stairs, he heard voices in the living room. Curious, he peeked and saw Andre and Elizabeth talking quietly. Do you think Francisco suspects anything?" Andre asked with a mischievous smile. "He doesn't have a clue." "Francisco is a fool," Elizabeth replied, laughing as she poured herself a glass of wine. "He fell for our lie perfectly, thinking we're siblings when we're actually just friends," Andre said with a triumphant expression. Paolo felt his heart race upon hearing this. They had been lying to Francisco all along. Elizabeth continued. He's so naive. If he knew the truth, he'd be devastated. But he doesn't suspect a thing." She laughed again.
So, what do we do now?"
Andre asked, moving closer to Elizabeth. We stick to the plan." "Of course we do. Everything is going according to plan." "Francisco trusts me completely," Elizabeth said, taking a sip of wine and looking at Andre. "We just need to keep Paolo under control. He's the only one who could mess up our plans." That kid. He seems smart," Andre commented, frowning. But if he tries anything, we know how to handle him." Paolo felt a chill run down his spine. He never imagined that Elizabeth could be plotting something so sinister. He needed to tell his father as soon as possible, but Francisco wouldn't be back for another week. Until then, he would have to endure the situation. As Andre and Elizabeth continued their conversation, Paolo silently returned to his room, trying to process everything he had just discovered. His mind was racing with questions and concerns. He felt betrayed and vulnerable but knew he had to stay strong. The next morning, Paolo woke up early and began his chores as usual. Elizabeth barely glanced at him, absorbed in her own activities. Ronaldo was in the living room playing video games, oblivious to everything. Throughout the week, Elizabeth became even more demanding of Paolo, requiring him to do more chores and treating him with harsh and cutting words. Paolo felt increasingly tired and overwhelmed but remained steadfast, waiting for his father's return. When Francisco finally came back, Paolo rushed to hug him, feeling a tremendous sense of relief. Francisco brought gifts for everyone, and Paolo experienced a fleeting moment of joy when he received a new set of tools to continue working on his grandfather's car. Paolo felt he could wait no longer. He knew he had to tell his father the whole truth, even if it was hard to believe. That night, he asked Francisco for a serious talk. "Dad, I need to talk to you." "It's about Elizabeth and Andre," Paolo began, his voice trembling. Francisco furrowed his brow, concerned. What happened?" he asked, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "They're not who they say they are. I overheard them talking one night and discovered that they're not siblings, they're just friends, and they're deceiving you. Elizabeth is using you, and they talked about me, saying they need to get rid of me because I'm getting too suspicious," Paolo said, with tears in his eyes. Francisco stood silent, trying to process what he had just heard. It was hard to believe that Elizabeth, the woman he had been married to for a year, could be lying to him. "Paolo, this is very serious." "I don't know what to think, but I promise I'll check if this is true," Francisco said, trying to comfort his son. Francisco spent the following days deep in thought, trying to figure out how to resolve the situation. He knew that confronting Elizabeth directly would be futile as she would deny everything. So he decided to take a more discreet approach. One day, he waited for everyone to leave the house and installed hidden cameras in several rooms. The cameras recorded both video and audio. For a few days, nothing happened, but then one night, Francisco reviewed the footage and heard a conversation that made him fear for Paolo's safety. He's talking to Francisco. We need to deal with this kid somehow, or he'll ruin our plans," Elizabeth said, her voice laced with malice. Yes, we need to act quickly. He could be a serious problem for us, Andre replied. Francisco felt a shiver of dread. There was no longer any doubt, he needed to get Paulo out of the house immediately. Without wasting any time, Francisco woke Paulo and explained the situation. Son, we need to leave here now. It's dangerous to stay, Francisco said, his voice urgent. They quickly packed some clothes and went to a hotel, where they stayed hidden for a few days. Elizabeth soon realized that something was wrong because Francisco wouldn't act like this without a reason. She began to suspect that he had already uncovered their plan. While Francisco was determined to gather evidence against Elizabeth, to his surprise, he discovered that she had a criminal record. Elizabeth and Andre were working together to scam wealthy men. Andre would find them, and Elizabeth would seduce them, only to take their money later. Francisco couldn't believe he had been married to such a woman for a year. Francisco gathered all the evidence he could and contacted the authorities. He knew it was the only way to ensure Paulo's safety and seek justice. The shock of discovering that Elizabeth was a criminal left him devastated, but he knew he needed to stay strong for his son. While they waited for the authorities to take action, Francisco and Paulo stayed in the hotel, trying to find a bit of normalcy amidst the chaos. Francisco reflected on how he had been deceived and how it almost cost his son's safety. I'm so sorry, Paulo. I'm sorry I didn't believe you before, Francisco said, tears in his eyes, hugging his son. It's okay, Dad. The important thing is that we're together now and safe, Paulo replied, hugging him back tightly. Despite everything, they knew they had each other and that together they could overcome any adversity. A few days later, the police arrested Andre and Elizabeth, putting an end to the deceit that had disturbed Paulo and Francisco's lives. Ronaldo, Elizabeth's son, was sent to live with a distant aunt, someone who could properly care for him. Finally, Paulo and Francisco found the peace they had longed for. With the house calm and free from the tension that had hovered over them, father and son were able to enjoy moments of tranquility and reflection. One afternoon, as they rested in the living room, Paulo couldn't help but express a lingering doubt. Dad, one thing doesn't make sense to me, Paulo began, looking at Francisco. Elizabeth and Andre were scamming wealthy men, but you're not rich, you're a truck driver and don't earn much. Why would they try to scam you? Francisco sighed deeply, visibly thoughtful. After a moment of silence, he decided to reveal a secret he had kept for a long time. Paulo, there's something I've never told you. When your mother passed away, she had a large sum of money in the bank, Francisco said, with a serious expression. She was always very hardworking and saved money. When she received her terminal cancer diagnosis, she took action. She made a will transferring all her money to me. She said the money was to be used for you when you were older, for your education. Paulo was shocked by the revelation, his eyes wide. And you've kept that money all this time? He asked, still trying to process the information. Yes. It was your mother's, and she wanted it to be used for you and your education, Francisco replied with a sad smile. Andre and Elizabeth found out about it and came after me. Paulo nodded, understanding the situation. I never would have imagined, Paulo said, still in shock. Neither did I, son. But now that we know the truth, we can move forward, Francisco responded firmly. After a moment of silence, Francisco smiled and looked at Paulo with a glint in his eyes. Actually, I have a surprise for you, he said, getting up. Come with me. Curious, Paulo followed his father to the garage. Francisco opened the door, and to Paulo's surprise, there was Pedro's car, fully assembled. Every part was in place, gleaming under the garage light. The car was perfect, as if it had just come out of Pedro's skilled hands. Dad, this is amazing. Did you finish putting the car together? Paulo exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. Yes, Paulo. I thought it was the right time to finish what we started. Your grandfather would be proud, Francisco said, smiling. Paulo ran to the car, touching each part with reverence. He felt a deep connection to his grandfather and immense relief at seeing the project finally completed. Thank you, Dad. This means so much to me, Paulo said, hugging Francisco tightly. You're welcome, son. We're in this together, and we always will be, Francisco replied, returning the hug with affection. With the car assembled and the truth revealed, Paulo and Francisco were finally able to move forward, stronger and more united than ever. They knew that together they could face any challenge life presented. And with the memory of Pedro and the protection of Paulo's mother, they felt prepared for a bright and promising future. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.